This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 477 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. The Kansas City Chiefs and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are set to battle in the big game, and FanDuel Sportsbook is giving you a chance to get in on the action with some can't-miss odds. Right now, new users can wager up to $5 on either Kansas City or Tampa Bay to win at plus 5,500 odds. That's right, a $5 bet on either team can win you $275. The biggest Sunday of the year will be here before you know it, so download the FanDuel Sportsbook app and make your first deposit to see the enhanced odds today. Must be 21 years or older and present in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Colorado, West Virginia, Iowa, Virginia, Michigan, Tennessee, or Indiana. New users only. Must wager on designated boost market. Deposit required. Max bonus $275. See full terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In Colorado, call 1-800-522-4700. In West Virginia, visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net. In Indiana, call 1-800-9-WITH-IT. Or in Tennessee, call Tennessee Redline 1-800-889-9789. I did it. Now let's get to these questions. The first question is from @MyronIsaacs. JJ, have you any historical analysis on the wide receiver success of such slim body types like Devonta Smith? I'm not convinced he should be a top 3 wide receiver selection in the draft. Okay, so we don't know exactly how big Devonta Smith is, but I've got him at 175 pounds in my database. I know Player Profiler, they also have him at 175, but for the sake of argument, let's say that he's 170. There have been 170-pound wide receivers who have been drafted before. Jakeem Grant was 165 coming out. The difference, of course, is what you call body type, or what we just say as BMI. Smith's BMI at 170 pounds would be 22.4. That's pretty freaking low for a wide receiver. Across a large sample, I haven't found that BMI is that huge of a deal in general for wide receivers. Running back is a different story, but BMI actually has seemed to matter less at wide receiver, at least in my model. So first off, probably a good idea to not overstate this. Would it be better if he was 6'3", 220, and he could move the way that he does? Of course. But I doubt he could do what he does without the frame that he has. We haven't had many wide receivers with that low of a BMI historically, which means you're not going to find anything statistically significant about players with that low of a BMI and how they translate a wide receiver in the NFL. But then more specifically, we generally don't have first-round wide receivers with low BMIs. The lowest I have in my database, which goes back to 2006, is Marquise Brown. He had a BMI of 24.5 versus Smith's 22-ish.5. Only Brown and Calvin Ridley had BMIs under 25 at the draft, among first-round wide receivers. What I'm saying here, guys, we just need to accept the fact that Devonta Smith is unlike any other wide receiver prospect that we've really ever seen, at least analytically. You can't fit him into a box. The good news is that his production profile is incredible. And that's what matters most. To me, he's a top 3 wide receiver in this class. And you could argue that he's the wide receiver 1. I don't think I'm going to have him there, but I understand why people do. This next question says, hey JJ, thanks for reading this note. I'll try to keep this short. 12-team, 1 quarterback, 6 points per touchdown pass, 6 bench spots. I drafted Deshaun Watson at a very reasonable $8 of a $200 budget. I picked up Aaron Rodgers as a free agent after being dropped in waivers week 2. Rationale, I personally would have played Aaron over my week 4 opponent's quarterback, so I played defense there. Week 4, Rodgers goes ham. Week 6, trade deadline. I tried to upgrade my starting lineup with package deals to teams I believed needed a quarterback upgrade. No dice. So the question, do you think it's a suboptimal strategy/process to use a bench spot to hold on to a stud quarterback and play matchups? Keep up the good work and thanks for the distraction in the time of COVID. Best, Dan. I think there's this idea out there that quarterbacks aren't valuable at all in fantasy football. And maybe I'm part of the problem as to why that's the case. But that's not true. They can have value. A lot of quarterbacks had value this year, and Aaron Rodgers was one of them. Just because you can get away with holding one quarterback on your roster doesn't mean that you have to hold one quarterback, or that you should. Your goal should be to acquire as much value as you can. And even though that'll usually come in the form of running backs and wide receivers, it can be a quarterback too. Now, it sucks that you couldn't really capitalize on having that value, since quarterbacks are tough to trade because they do hold less value than other positions. I would also bet that if your trade deadline was later in the season, you could have gotten a deal done. But just because you can get by with one quarterback on your roster doesn't mean that you have to roster just one quarterback. Aaron Rodgers was still a valuable piece. You wouldn't want your opponents especially to have Aaron Rodgers. And it's especially easier to hold on to that second quarterback if you weren't passing up on opportunities for good running backs and wide receivers on the waiver wire each week. So the bottom line, don't be afraid to roster two quarterbacks, even if you have a stud. Now, don't do it if you don't have to, but too many people think they absolutely shouldn't and they can't do it. That's not true. This next question is from @Stags2. Since offensive production was way up this past year and regression is coming, what type of players are you targeting? Does that shift your focus to guys that have more of a steady or high floor, or do you think that this production is sustainable or close to repeatable next year? So first off, I don't think regression is absolutely inevitable. There were reasons for this offensive spike that do seem sustainable, but I do think there are reasons as to why it might not be super sustainable, like the lack of prep or the lack of fans that helped opposing teams dictate more offensively. But really, I'm not going to approach 2021 any different from a regression standpoint. I don't know why you'd necessarily have to. You're still looking for the same things. You're looking for quarterbacks who threw touchdowns at a super high rate like Aaron Rodgers, and you're seeing where they're being drafted, and you're usually fading them after seeing their high cost. And you're doing that for player after player after player. So the type of player that I'm targeting isn't changing. This next question says, do you think the pro day versus combine measurements and workouts will have a bias in data for this year's class? If so, will the effect be negligible? Pro days have notoriously been favorable for players, so you have to take these numbers with a grain of salt. There are ways to adjust those numbers though, which is what I'm going to do. But as I've said before on this show, I use athletic measurables more as a threshold for players to hit as opposed to them really, really mattering. Like, is there a massive difference between a running back hitting a 110 speed score versus a 100 speed score? Not really. Production and other factors are going to be more important. But we have to make sure players hit certain thresholds. It's very rare for me to drastically change my view on a player because of how he worked out, because of how he looked in shorts. It can change my view, but not drastically. It's not to say that these numbers don't matter. There's just a lot more about prospecting through data than those numbers. I had to shorten this next one a bit, but it's a question about the running back dead zone in drafts. It says, hey JJ, thanks for all the work on the show. Definitely combines informative and listenable like nothing else out there. I appreciate that. My question is whether this concept, the running back dead zone, is likely to apply in 2021, and if so, whether it will cover the same range of rounds as it did in 2020. Looking at some very early mocks, it's not all that uncommon to see young running backs with some pretty major upside going in rounds 3 to 4, from 2020 rookies like Swift, Akers, and especially Gibson and Dobbins, to last year's first rounders coming off down years, Sanders and Mixon, as well as Etienne and Harris from the upcoming class. Obviously, that may all change by summer, but just suppose for the sake of argument that it doesn't. Might it be more legitimate this year than most to opt in the early middle rounds for running backs who have already had good NFL results and have RB1 upside, or even top shelf rookies who could be this year's smash in the fantasy football playoffs like Taylor this year, over really solid wide receivers in the same range? I'd love to hear any thoughts that you might have. Thanks again, Griffin. Yeah, so look, anytime we talk strategy or anytime that you guys hear about strategy, it should never be a set in stone type thing. Strategy is there to not be some defined thing that you should absolutely do no matter what. You have to adjust during a fantasy football draft. The best players at fantasy football are the ones who can read the room and adjust on the fly. Strategy is there to help you increase your probability of winning. And historically, and this is across many, many years, but historically, RB2s in fantasy football, they've kind of sucked. And by RB2s, I'm talking about players who were drafted as RB2s, not how they finished. Although you can make the same argument for how they finished too. Hence the dead zone that people talk about and what I talked about over the offseason and on the show earlier this week. If market prices start to change dramatically and the player landscape changes, then we should adjust. I'd see it as no different as what I was feeling last season at the quarterback position. You adjust with more information. But for the record, you mentioned round 3 in your question. I actually have found that the big drop-off occurs in 12-team leagues around round 4. Round 3 backs haven't been nearly as bad as round 4 backs. especially at the front end. And my guess is that we see some of those running backs getting drafted in round 3, where it's typically not as bad. ADP is going to be different depending on source, though. And I really do think that we need to talk about this in terms of RB2s instead of the rounds they're being drafted in because of that. Because ADP is going to fluctuate depending on where you're getting it from. Just generally speaking, RB2s don't give you a great ROI. But I can't answer this question really without knowing where players will land. I can just say that strategy is there to guide you and to help you increase your probability in winning. That you should always be flexible. And then I do bet that we still generally get a group of running backs that pans out similarly to what we've seen in the past. Maybe the position is a little bit deeper and we'll feel good about running backs through round 3. But round 4 and 5 is still likely to be an area of drafts that you want to avoid with running backs. More than likely, at least. It's just hard to say anything definitively without knowing which running backs are even going to be there. This next question says, "Hi JJ, love the show. Thanks. I keep hearing analysts encouraging leagues to add more flex spots for the benefit of managers who draft well. My response is, why not just use best ball scoring? Just to be clear, I mean your highest scoring players as your starters mechanic, not other aspects of best ball leagues like no in-season management. I think this would help good drafters and would also benefit managers who drafted sleepers who might emerge later in the season, which more flex spots won't necessarily help. I run a league that uses best ball scoring and has in-season roster management, and everyone loves the lower maintenance. And best of all, for fantasy analysts, no start-sit questions. Thanks for all the advice and information. Best, Luke." So I don't have anything against this at all. I love best ball. But I'm not sure it solves what analysts are saying. You mentioned that analysts are encouraging leagues to add more flex spots. That's totally true. I do it all the time. And you also correctly mentioned that it's for the benefit of managers who draft well. But that doesn't mean that we want to eliminate start-sit decisions. We just want rosters to be deeper. Maybe that means that you have a shallower bench. I'm not sure. But I don't think it's necessary to go all the way to best ball for something like that. Like, sure, best ball would allow teams who drafted some great values late. Best ball formats would allow them to benefit because they're getting much more use out of those players. But you're also changing the game pretty drastically in doing that. There's a slightly different approach that you would want to take to your draft. And then you're missing out on start-sit decisions. Which to me, I don't want to just eliminate that. So I do agree with you. You could go to best ball formats to alleviate some of this. I just don't think it's fully necessary since that changes more than just simply benefiting the teams who drafted well and got a lot of depth. The last question this week is from @TS_Werner. Montgomery is a sell high guy, right? No way the Bears don't bring on a running back this offseason, right? Well, I think there's a way the Bears don't bring on a running back, so I wouldn't necessarily bank on that. But I do think Montgomery is someone that I would be looking to sell, yes. Not only did he surge down the stretch through a cakewalk schedule and pretty unsustainable touchdown production, but he did what he did this year without literally any competition. Tariq Cohen went down early this season. Montgomery's year 1 to year 2 target share ended up rising from 6% to 11%. At the very least, Tariq Cohen's return is going to change David Montgomery's outlook. And then, maybe something happens this offseason where they add a body to that backfield. If that happens, then Montgomery looks even worse. But look, I think Montgomery's fine. He's not someone that I would build around, though. And looking at DynastyLeagueFootball.com's January startup ADP, he's listed at RB20. He comes in at 36th overall. I don't necessarily think the running back ranking is that far off, though I would rather have a guy like Joe Mixon, but there's no way I'd take Montgomery over guys like T. Higgins, Mike Evans, or Amari Cooper. And really, the list goes on and on there. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate you listening. Have a great weekend, and I will talk to you next week.